All right, thank you. So what you're going to start with is actually the labor market. Let's start with the labor market. And the labor market, as I always do, I always prepare my notes as we go, right? So on our labor market, we should understand that labor, one thing that you should understand, that labor is one of the factors. Let me put the number of the 4 factors of production. Labor is one of them. It is one of the 4 factors of production. And the other 3, we call them land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. These are the factors of production. But today we are focusing mainly on this one, which is labor. Why are we focusing mainly on labor? Because all these other factors of production can be manipulated, but it's only labor that cannot be manipulated. And you should know that the remuneration of labor is salaries and wages. The remuneration of labor is salaries and wages. But first of all, let's define what labor is. Let's define labor. Definition of labor. We can say labor refers to the physical and intellectual contribution of human beings towards production. This is the physical or the intellectual, or we can say the mental contribution of human beings towards production. That means your labor might be skilled or non-skilled. So if we are talking about skilled labor, we mean the labor that is trained, that is sharpened to do something, that is skilled labor. Unskilled labor is that type of labor which is not skilled, something that is not sharpened, which anyone can do. If we talk about, let's say, being a dagger boy on a construction site or lifting up cement, the most physical work is unskilled. But all those works, all those jobs that will need your intellectual application, we can say those ones are skilled labor. All right. So labor is a very sensitive topic because it can be easily, all labor issues can be easily politicized. And in South Africa, we've got a lot of labor unions. And also in South Africa, if we still remember the history of apartheid, all those injustices that happened before, labor becomes a very sensitive issue. That's why we have to study labor among all the other factors of production that we can talk about. And one thing that you have to know about the labor market is that in the labor market, firms, not firms, firms are the demanders of labor, while households are the suppliers. I want you to look at this vice versa. We have turned the tables now. In the labor market, the firms are the demanders of labor, while the households are the suppliers. But if you look at the goods market, in the goods market of the circular flow, of income, in the goods market of the circular flow of income, we can say now households demand goods and services. Goods and services, while firms supply these. So it's now the reverse. Remember, it's secular. That's why we call it a secular flow of income, because in the labor market, it is the firms that demand and households are the suppliers. But in the goods market, in the secular flow of income, we find that the households demand the goods and services, and then the firms supply these. So let's look at the demand for factors, or for demand for labor as a factor of production. So I'll write here demand for labor. Let's look at demand for labor. Demand for labor. Right, let me remove this. And then start this. Come. So the demand for labor is said to be a derived demand. Demand for labor, this one you should know. Demand for labor is derived demand. I don't know where I'm writing. Demand for labor is derived demand. I don't know where I wrote. Okay. It is derived demand. So when we say derived demand, we mean that labor is not demanded for its own purpose, but it is demanded for the goods that it produces. So I mean, labor is not demanded. Labor is not demanded for what it is. It is but for what it produces. It is not demanded for what it is, because there's nothing that you would do with human beings, even if you demand human beings. But it's a derived demand because they are actually demanding labor for what labor produces. For example, we can say cooks are demanded for the food they prepare. So it's a demand that is derived. It is not something that comes from that we need labor itself, but we want what labor produces. Labor produces goods and services. So the demand for labor is actually a derived demand because it is coming from what that labor produces. All right. It's like you find someone who is befriending a parent of a certain girl. You ask, that boy is actually making favors to you as a mom. If that guy has got a car, he takes you, he gives you money. But this boy is not doing these favors to you as in for who you are as the mom, but for what you can produce. Maybe you've got a girl that you are raising and that boy wants that girl. So the demand of that girl is the demand, or what you're doing to that mom is a derived sort of demand, because you are having that because of what is behind you, because of what you can produce. That's what we call derived demand. All right. So in the labor market, we can say, unlike the labor market, the product market produces final goods. These are not factors of production. Demand in the product market is not a derived demand. In reality, the product market creates the derived demand for the labor market. So we can say the product market produces derived demand for the goods, for the labor market. Right, let me pause a little bit and then ask people if they've got questions. Let me ask people if they've got questions before I proceed to the supply of labor. Before I move to the supply of labor, All right. Let me see this. All right, so far so good. That's bonga. Right, let me take this diagram of the demand for labor, this one. Let me copy it there and put it there. I want this demand of labor to be all right. That is the demand for labor. So usually this is the individual demand for labor. So what you put on the x-axis is the quantity of labor that is demanded by the firm. And then what you put here is the wage rate. So this is the graph above. The graph above shows the individual firm demand for labor. The individual firm's demand for labor. And it should be deduced that. Want to see what we can deduce from that diagram, from that curve. Okay. So I want to put that in point form to see what we can deduce from the demand for labor. Right. Let's see what we can deduce from the demand for labor. So the first thing that we can deduce from that demand for labor is there is an inverse relationship. There's always an inverse relationship between the wage rate and labor itself. Right. So let's say I want to put some points there. Okay. If we take a perfectly competitive labor market. If we take a perfectly competitive labor market, the individual firm demand curve will be horizontal, right? This is very, very important. Okay. Remember when we were doing perfect competition, we said the demand is equals to the MR, which is equals to the price. The demand curve was horizontal when we were dealing about with the perfect competition. The same applies when you are dealing with perfectly competitive labor market. The demand curve for an individual is also horizontal. So the graph above shows individual firms demand curve. Let me put something here. Individual firms demand for labor in a non-competitive market. In a non-competitive market. But the moment we go to a competitive market, this demand curve should be horizontal. It should be horizontal. Right. Then the other thing that we should deduce there is the market demand for labor is the horizontal summation of the individual firm, firms as demand case. All right. So we said the individual firm in a perfectly competitive market has got a horizontal demand curve. So in a perfectly competitive market, it therefore means the market demand for labor, it will be downsloping. Okay. So the market demand for labor will be down sloping. To be down sloping, showing an inverse relationship. Showing an inverse relationship between the wage rate. An inverse relationship between the wage rate and the number of employees. So remember the law of demand, it applies here. The law of demand applies here. What are we actually saying? We are saying if the wage rate is high, it is costlier to hire more employees. So if the wage rate is high, it is costly to hire employees. But then I'll just say, and vice versa. So this is what I want you to see on this curve. It shows that at wage rate W1, you are operating at A, and you are only demanding as a maybe as a market, you are only demanding L1 employees. When the wage rate drops to W2, firms tend to go to labor intensive ways of production where they demand more workers because they are only paying them less. So remember, we say the demand now is the firms that are demanding. So this demand curve is about firms that are demanding the employees. And always you draw the demand curve with the wage rate on your left and the number of workers or the number of laborers on your x-axis. On your x-axis. So this is what you derive. Let's go on to the supply curve. Let's go on to the supply curve of labor, labor. So we can call it the supply of labor. The supply curve. The supply curve of labor. This you have to understand, the supply curve of labor. One, we have deduced that the demand curve of a firm for labor is horizontal in a perfectly competitive market. But the supply curve for labor now, this is what we want to focus on. We can say, okay, let me do this. The supply curve, okay, the supply of labor is done by households. The supply of labor is done by households. It is done by households, right? The supply for labor is done by households. So what actually happens when the supply of labor, if you are an employee, what would you want? At higher wage rates, you are prepared to work more hours. You are prepared to work more hours than at lower wage rates. This is natural. You are prepared to work more hours at higher wage rates than at lower wage rates. Therefore, the supply curve for labor is positively sloping, because you always want to work more at higher wages. That means the supply curve is positively sloping. However, there is a bending that happens, right? However, however, there is a bending an upward. Let's go to backwards bending. There is a backward bending of the supply curve. At certain levels of wage rates. This is what we want to see now. So you find the supply curve is not a straight line, but it bends backwards at higher wage rates. So what you need to understand, first of all, is let me define what we call the substitution effect. Substitution effect. You understand this when I show you the graph of the supply curve. So let's look at the substitution effect. So with the substitution effect, you have to understand that as the wage rate increases, I thought this one is, as the wage rate increases, households, which are the suppliers of labor, households are prepared to substitute leisure for work. Okay, it's normal that if your work is paying, the more you work, the more money you get. You tend to substitute your leisure time for work. That means as the wage rate is increasing, you are actually substituting your leisure for work. So the substitution effect is higher at lower wage rates than higher wage rates. All right, then let's look at the income effect. So we've got these two effects, the substitution effect and the income effect of labor. So the income effect of labor states that the substitution effect is true to certain levels, but after a certain wage rate, which we would call a point of satiation. When you are satisfied, I know you'll never be satisfied, satiation, which we would call a point of satiation. Workers or households would tend to prefer working less hours because they can get almost their ideal income. So in this case, the supply curve bends backwards. Right, as you can see on this diagram. So it bends backwards. I want you to look at this one. This is the supply curve of labor, which shows the substitution effect and the income effect. So from point A to point B, that's the substitution effect. So you are seeing that what is happening from a wage rate of 10 to 15 rands per hour, people are willing to work more hours because they are substituting their leisure for work. It's paying to to live leisure and to go for work. But it will reach a certain level of income, somewhere between your 60 and 70, where you have reached almost a point of satiation, where you would require or you would need to work less hours and get almost the same number, almost the same income. That's where the supply curve bends backwards. When the supply curve bends backwards, this is now the income effect. So from point B going onwards, this is the income effect that causes the bending. From A to B is the substitution effect that causes the bending. It therefore means, yeah, the income effect from A to B is weaker than the substitution effect. From B going forward, the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect. All right. So I don't know if there's any question on this one before I continue. On the income effect and the substitution effect and the supply curve. Income effect, supply. Okay. Any question there? Any question? If there's no question, I'll continue. All right. Let me look at the factors affecting the supply of labor. Factors affecting the supply of labor. What is it that affects the supply of labor? Right. The first one that we do not want to mention, it's the wage rate. We can say the wage rate. And remember, this causes movements. This causes movements along the supply curve. It causes movements along the supply curve. Then the next, we can say the non-wage benefits of a job. If there is more non-wage benefits, people tend to prefer to offer their skills. Then we can say the demographic characteristics. Demographic characteristics of a population or of a country. Okay, so you see some areas are dominated by women, some areas are dominated by men, some areas are dominated by the age, some areas are dominated by the economically active people. So the demographic areas or the demographic characteristics of a population will affect the supply of labor. And also the other thing, laws governing the migration of labor. Right. The laws that govern the migration of labor. Are you very accommodative of skilled labor that comes from other countries? Or do you allow your skilled labor also to go to other countries? So those ones, there are factors that affect those factors, they also affect the supply of labor. So we can also say the number of qualified people. The number of qualified people. Number of qualified people and the cost of education. The cost of education. Not only the cost of education, even the structure of education. You see, in certain countries, you don't just leave school and then you start working for private companies. You have to do maybe 2 years of patriotism, working for the government for free or just being given a stipend. So government always have got some free labor that it has got. And then you later go to the private section, to the private sector. So this is structure of education, how the government is structured its labor market or its education, it will affect the supply of labor. All right. Any question before we proceed? Sorry. Any question before we proceed? Can I proceed? All right, let me see. All right. So, I just want to say something about this graph. All right. So let me write here the market equilibrium. Or can I say equilibrium? Let me see if there is a question. All right, Hlatswayo, yes. We always add more factors. All right, equilibrium, and also the order that is in your study guide, I tend to dismantle it because I want to put it into package it in a way that you would understand. So you can say equilibrium in the labor market. Equilibrium in the labor market. Right. So in the labor market, equilibrium is always achieved equilibrium is always achieved when quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, right? Where quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. This determines the wage rate. This determines what we call the wage rate, or the WE, which is the wage at equilibrium. Okay, so for an individual firm, the demand curve is horizontal. The demand curve is horizontal, and supply curve is downsloping. The supply curve is downsloping, as shown below. All right. So as you can see, this one, it shows, this one is the supply. Okay, this one is the demand for labor. All right. If you take this one, I want to take, I'm trying to look for the case. All right. If you say this horizontal, it becomes the demand for labor, which is the wage rate. And then this one becomes the supply for labor. So this is the marginal revenue product, or we can actually say we can actually put the wage rate here. And if we put, I think, let me look for a proper diagram that you would understand. Where I can look for a proper diagram quickly. So I can say equilibrium, labor market. Equilibrium labor market. Let me look for an image. Okay. All right, let me just take this. Right, I'll just copy this and paste it somewhere there. Though it's not the best one that I was looking for, but I think this one can serve the purpose. Okay. I'm trying to illustrate the equilibrium in the labor market. I wanted the horizontal demand curve because in the labor market, we said for an individual firm, the demand curve is horizontal, but this one becomes the equilibrium of the labor market, not of an individual firm, but of the labor market. And this one is the supply curve, and this one becomes the wage rate. Then, if you look at the diagram below now, after this one, this diagram below, it shows that the wage rate, let me reduce the font here. The wage rate, which we call WE, should always be greater than the marginal revenue product. Remember, the word marginal means extra, the marginal revenue product. Always the wage rate should be greater than the marginal revenue product or equals to the MRP. Right. So always equilibrium is achieved when WE, which is the wage rate, is equals to marginal revenue product. So this is illustrated by this curve that is below here. So let's say the prevailing wage rate is 4. Let's say the prevailing wage rate is 4. If the prevailing wage rate, remember, when we say marginal revenue product, we mean the revenue that you get from employing the extra laborer. So from, let's say you are at A and you want to move to B. From A to B, the increase, the marginal revenue product is 10, meaning that is the same. But let's move from A to this point here. That is from 1 employee to 3 employees, from 2 to 3 employees. It shows that the marginal, the increase becomes 8 from 10. But that 8 is still higher than the wage rate. That means it's acceptable. But if we are at equilibrium at point C, where the wage rate is equivalent to the marginal revenue product, which is this one, the marginal revenue product, and always marginal revenue product decreases. So if you move from C to D, it's not desirable because the marginal revenue product is shifting from 4 to 2. It means if you are employing an extra worker, the extra worker is bringing you less benefit than the salary you are giving to that extra worker. You are prepared to give that extra worker $4, but that extra worker brings you only $2. So are you going to employ the extra worker? It therefore means this becomes, that C, it becomes your equilibrium. If you check again, this curve that goes down becomes your supply curve, and it becomes your demand curve, sorry. And this one becomes your supply curve, and this becomes your point of equilibrium. Right. Any questions so far before we go on to almost the last part of the labor market, which is government intervention in the labor market? Government intervention in the labor market. Okay, so let me do this and say government intervention. All right, I can see there's a question there. All right, can you set we in brackets where? All right, this one. I think the person who wrote refers to that one. Right. So the government intervention in the labor market. Okay. Government intervention in the labor market. It's not very complicated, it's simple, but there's certain things that I want you to get from here. All right. So the government will always intervene in the labor market because the labor is very sensitive. All right, thanks. So we are saying the labor market is very sensitive and maybe subject to exploitation. Maybe subject to exploitation. That's why the government should intervene. The government should intervene to make sure there is fair treatment. Make sure there is fair treatment in the labor market. All right. So labor, we really need the government to intervene in the labor market because it's subject to exploitation. Remember apartheid, where people used to be paid very low salaries and wages because some people were regarded as slaves. And during the slave trade, people were not even paid. People, they were just taken freely. They were used in plantations, just like that. That's why the government now needs to intervene in the labor market, because without the intervention of the government, we can have exploitation. So we can say the government intervenes. The government intervenes mostly by setting minimum wages. By setting minimum wages. Let me see. To make sure, not to make it sure. Okay, where is it? All right. Okay, thank you. Okay, the government intervenes mostly by setting minimum wages. Minimum wages are called price floors. Minimum wages are called price floors. If you still remember, we did this when we're doing supply and demand. So the government always intervenes in price floors. So how does the government put price floors? So the price floor, which is effective, is set above the prevailing wage rate. The prevailing wage rate. That is the one that is effective. Yes, it will be the same, Mr. Hlachwayo. The concept is the same. You will see when we explain this. Okay. So I want you to look at this diagram here. I want you to look at this graph. Okay, I will explain this graph. Let me do this and do this. Okay, so let me put this one at 12. Okay, so the prevailing wage rate, is WE. Okay, the prevailing wage rate is WE, and NE is supplied. We are now talking of labor in hours. NE is supplied and demanded. All right. So this is the equilibrium, the prevailing wage rate, WE. And at that point, it's NE, which is demanded and supplied. The government now considers that wage rate and exploitation. So it considers this an exploitation, so it intervenes. It intervenes by setting a minimum wage at WM, which means minimum wage at WM. But at WM, the hours labor demanded is NM, but labor supplied is N1. Labor supplied is N1. Okay, so what will result? The labor that is demanded by firms, because the wage rate is now high, what the government has said, especially domestic workers and these helpers. This is the market that is actually regulated because people can be exploited there. So the government sets a minimum wage at WM, but the demand falls because the households, you bosses, you don't want to pay. Because I believe of all the people that are attending my class, there is no helper here. There's no one who is coming from the kitchen and washing dishes to attend the lesson. So you guys, you are the ones that the government is targeting. Set a minimum wage at WM, but because the wage rate is high now, you demand less. But we have got a lot of domestic workers, the supply N1. So there will be unemployment. Unemployment is created equals to excess supply N1 minus NM. That becomes unemployment. Okay, so those domestic workers will not find. So this would be the same price ceilings. Okay, so these domestic workers will not find employment. These ones, they will not find employment. It may result. This may result in organizations where the workers will be registered. And promised work. So this is not very good because we have got unemployment. So the imposition of a minimum wage, it decreases the quantity of labor that is demanded and causes unemployment, which is the unemployment, which is actually between M and MN, okay, which is between, okay. So right now, if the equilibrium comes here, the unemployment will be equivalent to this and this. So there is a problem in your study guide there because your study guide says employment is between this and this. It will not be between there and there. Because what is going to happen is this one will become your new equilibrium. This one will become a new equilibrium. If this one becomes a new equilibrium, the unemployment will be the difference between N1 and NM, right? So this is how the government intervenes in the economy. From there, we'll look at market failure. Market failure, this is the last part, which is actually your chapter 10. Market failure and government intervention. We have been doing this from topic number 1, because in every topic we do government intervention. Right, but before we do government intervention, what do we have any questions here before we go on to government intervention? Questions? before we go to government intervention, market failure, and government intervention. Right. I believe I can proceed. Right, let me proceed. Market failure. Okay, let me remove the bold. Market failure exists because of the inefficient allocation of resources in the free market. Remember, we said there are three forms of markets. We said there's a free market economy, three types of economies. There's a free market economy, there's a mixed economy, and there's a command economy. So in a free market economy, there are failures which result in an efficient allocation of resources. And when we say inefficient allocation of resources, what do we mean? We mean non-provision of public goods. Non-provision of public goods. There are certain goods that will not be provided because everyone is looking at earning so much profits. Then we will have high prices if the government does not intervene. High prices by monopolies. You can have negative externalities. E.g. pollution. Okay. Negative externalities, e.g. pollution. So all these, there are examples of market failure. And if the market fails, what will result is that most people will be charged very high prices. They will be charged very high prices. And the government has to intervene to reduce, the government has to intervene to make sure that it rectifies this market failure. So I want to paste these market failure examples as they are in your study guide, because I don't want to add or subtract here. And we've been doing these things. You will understand when I explain types of market failure according to your textbook. These are the types of market failure. I've mentioned some of them, but I've mentioned only the negatives. Okay. Let me do this. Right. The first one is positive externality. So when we say an externality can be a benefit or it can be a harm that comes to a person who didn't pay for a good or a service. A person that was not originally intended to benefit or intended originally to suffer from something gets what you call an externality. If we have got a factory that is operating in Brakpan and that factory is producing a lot of smoke, the people that are benefiting from that factory are the owners of the factory. But the smoke that is affecting the people around Tsakani, around maybe Kwatema, or around, what is the other area? Around Boxburg, they receive what we call an externality, something that is external, that is not intended for, but it comes to you, which comes to the third parties. So an externality can be positive or negative. We can have the same factory building roads that lead to the factory, but those roads are not only going to be used by the company vehicles, they're also going to be used by residents around. So the road will be a positive externality and the smoke will be the negative externality. So these are also examples of market failure. We are saying a positive externality is a market failure because you are benefiting where you are not paying. So it's an inefficient allocation of resources. You are benefiting and you are not paying. And sometimes those that are intended to benefit don't benefit as much, right? So positive externalities, goods or services which give benefit to a third party, e.g. less congestion from cycling. And I gave you another example of a positive externality of a road that is constructed by a firm, which is later used by residents. That is another positive externality, right? Then negative externality, goods or services which impose cost on a third party, e.g. cancer from passive smoking, or respiratory diseases that come from pollution. That is a negative externality. Then merit good. We mean people benefit from education, but they underestimate the benefit of that education. Education can be paid for by parents that send students to school. But the parents also that didn't send students to school, they will benefit from the development that those students are going to bring in the area. And also they're going to benefit from the low crime rate in the area. Then you also have got demerit goods. The people that underestimate the cost of the good, like smoking. You see, this issue of cancer that comes from smoking, that means smoking is a demerit good, but education is a merit good, because we underestimate the benefit of it. It touches people around the nucleus where it's happening. And also the demerit goods, it also affects the people around. So demerit and merit are opposites. Then public goods, goods which are non-rival and non-excludable, e.g. police or national defense. So when we say a public good, they are characterized by non-excludability. You cannot exclude someone from consuming that good because they've consumed it. It's unlike a banana. If I take the whole banana and eat that banana, I've excluded the next person from consuming the banana. But if I drive along N1, if I excluded the next person, if I excluded Hlachwayo, I have not excluded Hlachwayo. If I excluded Obre, I cannot exclude Obre. I cannot exclude Mbali. I cannot exclude Avela. So those are public goods, non-rivalry. It means we can consume the same good at the same time. Anyone from Cape from Cape Town to Beitbridge, we don't allow only one vehicle to be driving, to be using N1 at a time. Various vehicles can be using that vehicle at the same time. That is non-rivalry in consumption. I mean, there is no fighting in the construction of that road, of that good. That is a public good. Like street lighting. If there is a street light, it doesn't mean that if I see because of that light, it will exclude the next person. And even the police, the presence of the police, this security, those are public goods. If you see in a free market economy, those goods are not provided for because people are rational people. They want goods that give profit. You can't get a profit from constructing a public light or a road because everyone is going to use it. Then monopoly power, when a firm controls the market and gets to set higher prices, again, it's an example of a market failure. Inequality, unfair distribution of resources in the market. Like in all our societies, we are not equal. If we were equal, we'll all be driving expensive cars, but some are driving Unos, Tatas, something are driving expensive Jaguars, some are driving Mercedes-Benz, some are even walking, some are using taxis because of the unfair distribution of resources in the market. You find a family, maybe in Randburg, every child has got their own bedroom. They've got 2 more bedrooms that are not used. But they've got a family in Davidton that has got only 1 bedroom. And people are sleeping facing different directions. And if you ask them, where do you sleep? They say somewhere there. That is unfair distribution of resources. If a person has got 7 children, he should have more bedrooms than a person with the 2 children. So the government intervenes to correct such. That's why it comes to provide housing for the people that cannot afford. Then factor immobility, geographical or occupational immobility. There are certain provinces, like the provinces, the Northern Cape, some part of the Western Cape, and some part of the Northwest, which are not reachable. Even employees don't want to go there because they are remote. So what does the government do? The government intervenes to make sure resources also go to service people there. They construct roads. They go to such places to make sure that the people in those areas are all serviced. Then agriculture, which is subject to market failure because of the volatility of prices and externalities. Externalities like the pollution of water sources, like the water sources get polluted from fertilizers, and we also have got soil erosion that comes from agriculture. So the government tends to intervene. Sometimes it subsidizes, sometimes it taxes, sometimes it gives the farmers the seeds to make sure that we have got food in the next season. Then information failure. We do not have symmetrical information, and the information that the people in KZN have is different from the information that is in Joburg. In Joburg, we know where we find cheap stuff, but you find the people in the Free State, sometimes they don't know where to get some stuff, and they are charged exorbitant prices. So sometimes the government comes in. Then the principal agent problem is when you work on behalf of somebody and you have got your own agenda that you want to achieve that is different from the one that is sending you. Let's say a person that is working for the government. A person that is working for the government as a policeman. The government wants us to reduce crime in the societies and communities. But you as the policeman, you also want to feed, you get bribed. You also want your house, you also want a good car, you get bribed, and you partake in the crime. So that is like the principal agent problem, where the aim of the agenda of the one that is sending you is different from your own agenda. The principal agent problem is often discussed when you are talking about the director who is working for the shareholders. The shareholder is looking for profit. Not the shareholder, the director, the one who is managing, is looking for profit. But the shareholder is looking for growth, earnings per share, and also the growth, the price, the earnings per share, and we are looking at the price, the increase in the price per share. Earnings per share and price per share. Those are two different ones. Then, how do government intervene in solving these negative externalities? So we have got this table again: factor mobility, structural unemployment, state investment in education and training. So we find the government investing in other areas: public goods, government funded public goods for collective consumption like roads, demerit goods, information campaigns, minimum age for consumption like smoking, under 18, merit goods, subsidies, information on private benefits of education, then imperfect information, statutory information, labeling. When you buy something, you label. High relative poverty, taxation, and welfare to redistribute income. We take in income from those that are privileged and we siphon it to people that are not very much privileged. That is another way of reducing this inequality. So, and then monopoly power, competition policy, measures to encourage few firms into a market. Then the last heading that we want to look at is that government failure. Government failure. So you see, the market fails and the government can also fail. So market fails and the government can also fail. And usually, the intervention of the government, right, let me say, the intervention of the government often brings more inefficiencies. More inefficiencies. And these result in government failure. But it should be noted that government failure comes as a result of market failure. Government failure comes as a result of market failure. Then let's look at the causes of government failure. What actually causes the government to fail? I think you can, you already know what causes the government to fail. The ANC, the people to say, hey, the ANC is not delivering. We want a new government. What causes that? So it can be greedy politicians. Greedy politicians. They've got their own agendas that they want to push. Even the voters, you can have the voters that are not informed. So not informed, and they make uninformed decisions. They choose a baboon because the baboon is on a party that they want, and they choose people that do not deliver because they are wearing the regalia of a party. So voters can also do that. We also have got interest groups. So these interest groups, they tend to lobby for certain changes. These interest groups, they always lobby for certain benefits. Then we also have got bureaucracies. Bureaucracies, this is the processes that needs to be followed in order for something to be executed. Bureaucracies, so it leads to long processes and delays. These are the causes of government failure. All right. I think I am done. Any question? Any question? Any question on this? All right. If there's no question, there are these two questions. Let me see. Okay, there's one. Okay, very well presented. Thanks, Mr. Hlachwayo. All right, let's look at November 2019. I think the next one was for 2020. It says, applying the information in the article, there was an article provided above. Thanks, Mbali. Applying the information in the article provided above and your knowledge on the market supply and demand curves, describe how the market will react to an introduction of a statutory minimum wage. So if how the market will react in the introduction of a statutory minimum wage. So usually this statutory minimum wage should be above equilibrium. So you should talk about unemployment. Indicate what the likely effect would be on the unemployment situation in South Africa if the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium rate. So they are only asking you to draw this graph, this one, and explain it. So you also have to explain that if the minimum wage is below equilibrium, it has no impact. But the question is asking for that diagram. Then you explain about unemployment. You also explain about even some people that will go to be employed because there will be unemployment. Even other people who settle for the lower wages in an informal agreement rather than being registered as a worker. You can say, oh, I can work for you, and you make a gentleman's agreement, you shake hands. People will resort to that. So question number one wants that graph. Okay, then we have got question number 3, says, with the aid of diagrams, differentiate between a price ceiling and price floor as government intervention measures to market failures. Okay, again, these price floors and price ceilings. Price ceiling is the maximum price that is set. Price floor is the minimum. Then for a price ceiling, which is the maximum price that is set, for it to be effective, it has to be below equilibrium. For a price floor to be effective, it has to be above equilibrium. So you draw 2 diagrams, one which shows a price ceiling, which is effective, and the one that shows a price floor, which is effective, which is above equilibrium, this one below equilibrium. Then explain with one of the above market control measures. Explain which one of the above market control measures is applicable in the labor market and justify why it is important. The one which is applicable in the labor market will be a price floor, which sets the minimum wage, because in the labor market, employees are bound to be exploited. So the answer for this one will be a price floor, and you can also show by a diagram. The diagram that you use is the same that I've shown you. Yeah, this one is the one that you would use on that question. Right, so what you have been doing, we have been going through the questions. I think I've shown, let me stop sharing this. Let me gallery view. All right. What I've done, I've managed to go through the whole syllabus from R to Z, from chapter 1 to chapter 10. So those that haven't gone through all the lessons that we have done, the way I was doing my lessons is to answer some of the questions that are in your question papers. That means if you go through this, you can literally get some of the questions just as they are, and you can answer them without even asking me. That is the way I have been structuring my lessons. So what we are going to do now, all the question papers, we have gone through them at the end of each chapter. We have managed to go through the questions at the end of each chapter. But however, what we are going to do on Tuesday, next week, we are going to take the multiple choice questions. And I think we may be able to finish the multiple choice questions on Monday. So anyone that has got question papers, please post them on the group so that we can go through question papers. Then a day before you write also, before you write economics, when are you writing economics? Someone to undo their mics to tell me when they are writing economics, when you are writing economics. All right, someone has written 9 June. That means on the 8th of June, we can have another session where you can ask any question, where we remind each other of everything that needs to be done. So we are going to have maybe an hour. Oh, no, it's not you, sorry. I'm thinking of another group that I'm going to be having sessions with on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But I will see the subscription for that group. If that group is not that big, I can combine with you guys so that we can do them at once. You are not included in the paying of that 500 Rand that I advertise in the other group.